It was a quiet, crisp morning in the Maplewood suburbs. The sun had barely risen, casting a warm orange glow across the well-kept lawns and pristine driveways of the affluent neighborhood. Karen Thompson stepped out of her sleek black car, adjusting her sunglasses as she surveyed her surroundings with the meticulous eye she was known for. At 45, she had built a reputation in the neighborhood as someone who kept things in order, whether it was organizing community events or making sure the new neighbors fit the vibe of the area. Karen wasn't shy about speaking her mind, especially when she felt something or someone was out of place. Today, as she stepped onto her porch, something caught her eye. Walking down the sidewalk in a dark blue firefighter's uniform was Lucas, a black man who didn't look like he belonged to any of the houses nearby. Karen narrowed her eyes, the corners of her mouth tightening into a thin line. She watched him closely, her mind jumping to conclusions before she even knew the full story. "What is he doing here?" she muttered to herself. Her assumptions and prejudices began to bubble to the surface, twisting her perception of Lucas. She knew nothing about him except that he didn't fit her idea of who should be walking through her neighborhood. Lucas, on the other hand, was minding his own business. He was on his way to Maplewood Elementary for a community outreach event, part of a fire safety program for local schools. It wasn't his first time doing these programs, and he'd always enjoyed the opportunity to connect with kids and teach them how to stay safe. His uniform, neatly pressed and gleaming with the firefighter badge, made him stand out, though not always in the way he hoped. As Lucas neared Karen's home, she stepped off her porch and crossed her arms in front of him, blocking his path. "Excuse me," she said, her voice laced with disdain. "Do you need something?" Lucas stopped, his eyebrows raising slightly at her tone. He had seen this look before many times, in fact. It was the same look that told him before a word was spoken that he was being judged not by his actions, but by his appearance. Still, he remained calm. "Good morning," he said politely. "I'm on my way to the elementary school for a fire safety presentation." Karen didn't even blink at his explanation. Her gaze lingered on him suspiciously, and then her lips curled into a sneer. "Oh, right, sure. And how do I know you're not just walking around here, checking things out?" Lucas felt the knot in his stomach tighten. He knew exactly where this was going, but he didn't want to make a scene. He looked at Karen calmly, keeping his voice even. "Mom, I'm a firefighter. I'm just here to help with the kids' program." Karen scoffed, glancing at the other houses around them, as if waiting for someone to back her up. "A firefighter, huh?" In this neighborhood, her words were sharp and accusatory. "I know people like you always thinking you can just waltz into places you don't belong." Lucas took a deep breath. He had encountered this kind of behavior before, but it never got easier. He reminded himself to stay calm, to not let her ignorance get under his skin. "I'm just doing my job," he said simply, not wanting to engage further. But Karen wasn't done. She stepped closer, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial tone. "We've had trouble here before, you know. People coming around pretending to be something they're not. I know your type, and I'm not going to let you pull any tricks around here." Lucas's jaw tightened, but he remained silent. He had heard enough. Without another word, he nodded, walking past her with his head held high. As he continued down the sidewalk, he could feel her eyes burning into his back. It was the same story in different settings, a routine reminder of the barriers people like Karen tried to place in his path. But today, just like every other day, he pushed forward. As Lucas walked away, Karen stood rooted in her spot, watching him until he was out of sight. Her face was flushed with self-righteous indignation, but deep down, a flicker of doubt stirred. She shook it off, convincing herself that she had done the right thing, protecting her neighborhood from someone who didn't belong. But the day wasn't over yet. Karen had no idea that the very man she had insulted would soon be the one standing between her and the fire that was destined to consume her life in more ways than one. Later that day, the sun had risen higher, casting warm rays across Maplewood Elementary School, where the fire safety event was in full swing. Kids from the local neighborhood sat cross-legged on the grass, their wide eyes glued to Lucas, who stood at the front of the group in his full firefighter gear. He was in his element here, teaching the young children about the importance of safety, answering their questions, and demonstrating basic fire safety techniques. Lucas had always found comfort in these events. Here he was seen for who he was: a professional, a protector, someone who was making a difference in his community. The kids didn't care about his skin color or the neighborhood he came from. To them, He was a hero, and that's how he preferred to be seen. Now remember, Lucas said, holding up a bright red fire extinguisher, if there's ever a small fire, and you have one of these nearby, just remember the word pass, pull the pin, aim at the base of the fire, squeeze the handle, and sweep side to side. He demonstrated the motion as the children watched intently, some mimicking his actions with imaginary extinguishers of their own. A little boy in the front row raised his hand excitedly. "Mr. Lucas, what if the fire is really big?" Lucas smiled, crouching down to be on the kid's level. "If the fire is too big, you get out of the house as fast as you can. Don't try to put it out yourself. That's what we're here for." The boy nodded, his eyes wide with the weight of the responsibility he now felt. Lucas smiled again and ruffled the boy's hair before standing up. As the event wrapped up, parents began to arrive, picking up their kids and thanking Lucas and his crew for their time. The firefighters started packing up their equipment, and Lucas chatted with a few of his fellow crew members, feeling a sense of accomplishment. However, as Lucas was loading the last of the equipment into the fire truck, he spotted Karen across the parking lot. She was walking toward the school, having just picked up her teenage son. As soon as their eyes met, Karen froze. She quickly turned her gaze away, clearly embarrassed by their earlier encounter. Her son, oblivious to the tension, waved excitedly toward Lucas, having just finished watching the fire safety demonstration with his class. "Mom, that's the firefighter I was telling you about," the boy said excitedly, tugging at her arm. "He taught us all this cool stuff about fires and how to stay safe. Did you know you're not supposed to open doors if they feel hot?" Karen's expression hardened as she tried to ignore her son's enthusiasm. "Yes, that's very nice," she said through gritted teeth, trying to avoid eye contact with Lucas. Her son, unaware of his mother's discomfort, waved again at Lucas, who smiled and waved back. As Karen quickly ushered her son to their car, she felt a pit in her stomach, a mixture of shame and pride. Shame because of the way she had treated Lucas earlier, and pride because, despite that, her son looked up to him. She wasn't ready to admit it, but a small part of her felt guilty. Lucas watched them leave, his heart heavy but his face calm. He had encountered people like Karen many times in his life, people who judged him before they knew anything about him. It wasn't the first time, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. But in moments like these, surrounded by the innocence and curiosity of children, he remembered why he did what he did. It was for them, the next generation, that he showed up every day. As Lucas packed up the last of the gear and climbed into the fire truck, the day's events replayed in his mind. He knew that Karen's attitude wouldn't change overnight, if it ever changed at all. But Lucas had long since learned that he couldn't control other people's thoughts or actions. All he could control was how he responded to them, and today he chose to rise above it. The fire truck pulled away from the school, heading back to the station as the sun began to set. The streets were quiet now, the calm before the evening bustle. Lucas stared out the window, his thoughts drifting between the day's events and the long shift ahead. He had no way of knowing that, in just a few short hours, he would find himself back in the same neighborhood where Karen lived, only this time, the stakes would be much higher. The sky was darkening as the Maplewood neighborhood settled into its usual evening routine. Families gathered for dinner, lights flickered on in every home, and the tranquil hum of suburbia filled the air. Lucas was back at the fire station, having finished his shift, when the call came through. House fire, Maplewood Avenue, multiple calls reporting heavy smoke. Fire is rapidly spreading, the dispatcher's voice crackled over the radio. Lucas felt a jolt of adrenaline as he pulled on his gear. Maplewood Avenue, the same upscale neighborhood where he had earlier encountered Karen. He didn't let that distract him, though. A fire was a fire, and there was no time for personal feelings when lives were at stake. The crew rushed to the fire truck, the familiar wail of the siren filling the air as they tore down the street toward the blaze. As they approached the scene, a thick cloud of black smoke billowed into the sky, its tendrils curling ominously toward the stars. The flames were already visible, licking the sides of a two-story home, Karen's home. Lucas's stomach tightened as he recognized the house, but he pushed aside any personal thoughts. This was about saving lives. The team pulled up in front of the house, and Lucas jumped out, his helmet already in place, his hands steady as he grabbed the hose. Neighbors had gathered on the sidewalk, their faces illuminated by the glow of the fire. Some were shouting, others on their phones, and a few pointed frantically toward the house. "She's still inside," someone yelled. "Karen's still in there." Lucas's heart raced as he scanned the house. Flames consumed the upper floor, and the windows on the first floor had already shattered from the heat. Smoke poured from every opening. He had seen fires like this before, ones that spread too quickly for anyone inside to get out on their own. Without hesitating, Lucas and his crew charged toward the house. His mind was racing, calculating how much time they had before the structure collapsed. The front door was still intact, but the heat radiating from it was intense, almost unbearable. Lucas kicked it open, and a wall of smoke hit them, thick and suffocating. Inside, the fire roared like a living beast, consuming everything in its path. Lucas could barely see through the dense smoke, but he knew they had to act fast. "Karen!" he shouted through his mask, his voice muffled by the sound of crackling wood and roaring flames. "Karen! Where are you?" There was no response, only the eerie crackle of the fire as it devoured the house. Lucas motioned for his crew to split up and search the different rooms. He made his way toward the living room, scanning the area as best he could in the dim light. Then, through the haze, he saw her. Karen was slumped on the floor near the staircase, barely conscious, her face streaked with soot. She had tried to escape, but the smoke had overwhelmed her. Lucas's heart pounded as he rushed to her side, gently lifting her head. Her eyes fluttered open for a moment, but she was too weak to speak. "Stay with me," Lucas whispered, though he wasn't sure if she could hear him. He carefully lifted her into his arms, the heat from the flames growing more intense by the second. The air was thick with smoke, and Lucas knew they had to get out fast. The house creaked ominously as he carried Karen toward the front door. The fire was spreading faster than he'd anticipated, and parts of the ceiling were beginning to collapse. Lucas shielded Karen as best he could, ducking under falling debris, his muscles burning from the effort of carrying her. Outside, the crowd watched in horror as the fire raged on. Several neighbors gasped as they saw Lucas emerge from the flames, Karen cradled in his arms. The heat was unbearable now, but Lucas didn't stop. He pushed forward, determined to get her to safety. Finally, he broke through the front door and staggered down the steps, his crew rushing to help him. Karen's body was limp in his arms, but she was still breathing. Lucas gently laid her down on the grass as paramedics rushed over, their faces grim as they began administering oxygen. Lucas stepped back, his chest heaving, and watched as the paramedics worked to stabilize Karen. His mind raced, replaying the events of the last few minutes. He had done his job, just as he always did. But this time, it felt different. This was the same woman who had looked at him with such disdain earlier that day, the same woman who had hurled racist insults at him without a second thought. And yet, when it mattered most, he had saved her life. As Karen began to regain consciousness, she opened her eyes and saw Lucas standing over her. Her vision was blurry, and for a moment, she seemed disoriented. Then, as recognition dawned, her eyes widened in shock. "You?" she whispered, her voice hoarse from the smoke. Lucas didn't respond, only nodding once before turning away. He didn't need her gratitude, and he certainly didn't need her to say anything now. His job was done, and as the paramedics continued their work, Lucas walked back toward the fire truck, the flames from the house still lighting up the night sky behind him. Lucas stepped away from the paramedics, his mind still racing, his heart pounding with the intensity of the moment. He had saved countless lives before, but this one felt different. He could hear the sound of the fire crackling behind him, still consuming the house as his fellow firefighters worked tirelessly to contain the flames. The heat from the blaze, though he was no longer inside, still radiated around him, and the smell of smoke clung to his skin. As Lucas walked back toward the truck to regroup with his team, the weight of what had just happened began to sink in. He had saved the life of a woman who had insulted him, disrespected him, treated him like he didn't belong. He knew he couldn't let those thoughts linger right now. He had a job to do, and he had to stay focused. There was no room for personal grievances when lives were on the line. But even as he tried to push those thoughts away, the memory of their earlier encounter lingered in the back of his mind. Her hateful words, the way she had looked at him with such contempt, it had all come flooding back the moment he realized it was her trapped inside that burning house. For a split second he had hesitated, but that moment was fleeting. Lucas knew his purpose. Saving lives was his job, no matter who those lives belonged to. As he turned his back to the scene, one of the neighbors, an elderly woman who lived across the street, approached him hesitantly. Her face was pale, and her hands trembled as she held a small blanket wrapped around her shoulders. "You saved her," the woman said softly, her voice barely audible over the sounds of the fire engines and the commotion around them. "I saw everything. You went in there and you pulled her out. I don't know what to say." Lucas gave her a brief nod, not sure how to respond. He was used to gratitude, but the look in this woman's eyes told him that she wasn't just thanking him for saving Karen's life. There was something else, a quiet, unspoken acknowledgement that she knew exactly what Karen had done earlier that day. The rumors had spread fast, and it seemed everyone in the neighborhood had already heard about the confrontation. Now they were faced with the undeniable truth. The very man Karen had insulted had been the one to save her life. Before Lucas could reply, the paramedics signaled that they were ready to transport Karen to the hospital. She was sitting up now, her breathing steadier as the oxygen mask helped her recover. Her face was streaked with soot, and her eyes were wide and glassy, still struggling to comprehend everything that had happened. As the paramedics prepared to lift her onto the stretcher, Karen's gaze drifted toward Lucas. Their eyes met for the first time since he had pulled her from the burning house. The shock and disbelief were still written across her face, but now there was something else, something deeper. Karen tried to speak, but her voice came out in a rasp. She coughed, wincing as she pulled the oxygen mask away from her face. "You," she croaked, her voice trembling with emotion. "You saved me." Lucas looked at her, his expression unreadable. He didn't need her thanks, and he certainly didn't need her guilt. But standing there in the glow of the fire, he couldn't help but feel the weight of this moment pressing down on both of them. Karen's life had been spared, but something else had changed too. Her perception of Lucas, and perhaps the world, had been irrevocably altered. "I was just doing my job," Lucas said quietly, his voice calm and steady. It was the same thing he told everyone who thanked him, but this time the words carried a deeper meaning. He didn't elaborate, and he didn't need to. Karen's eyes filled with tears as she struggled to find the right words. She looked at Lucas, her lips quivering, but no words came out. The shame and guilt that had been slowly creeping into her consciousness since the fire began to wash over her like a tidal wave. This man, this firefighter whom she had looked down on, insulted and belittled, had risked his life to save hers, and now she had no idea how to face him or herself. Lucas stood there for a moment, watching as the paramedics lifted Karen onto the stretcher and wheeled her toward the ambulance. He could see the realization dawning on her face, the full weight of her actions sinking in. But Lucas wasn't looking for an apology or a change of heart. He wasn't interested in trying to change who Karen was. People like her rarely changed overnight. All he wanted was to do his job, and he had done that. As the ambulance doors closed behind Karen, Lucas turned his attention back to the fire, still raging, but now mostly under control. The house was a total loss, and the neighborhood stood in stunned silence, watching the aftermath of the night's events. The fire would soon be extinguished, but the scars it left behind, both physical and emotional, would linger for a long time. Lucas walked back to his crew, exchanging brief nods with his fellow firefighters. They had all seen the way Karen had looked at him when she realized who had saved her, but none of them said a word. In their line of work, moments like these weren't uncommon. Racism, prejudice, and ignorance were as much a part of their daily lives as the fires they fought. But Lucas knew he couldn't let it define him. He had a duty, and that duty transcended the color of his skin or the opinions of others. As they began to pack up their equipment and prepare to leave the scene, Lucas glanced back one last time at the charred remains of Karen's house. The flames were gone now, replaced by smoldering ashes and the remnants of a life that had been forever changed. In that moment, he knew that, while the fire had taken everything from her, it had also given her something she didn't expect, a new perspective. Whether Karen would act on that realization was up to her. But Lucas had done his part. He had saved her life, and now it was up to her to figure out how to move forward. The morning after the fire, the Maplewood neighborhood was quiet, but the previous night's chaos still lingered in the air. Karen's house stood as a smoldering wreck, the charred remains of her once perfect home serving as a stark reminder of the fire that had torn through it. Yellow caution tape fluttered in the light breeze, cordoning off the area while neighbors walked by in hushed tones, their eyes glued to the ruins. Lucas was back at the fire station, exhausted but not surprised by how quickly the story of the night had spread. He had overheard whispers from some of the paramedics earlier that morning. The neighborhood was buzzing with talk about how he, the black firefighter, had saved Karen Thompson, the very woman who had insulted him hours before. Word traveled fast, especially in neighborhoods like Maplewood, where secrets were hard to keep. Lucas tried not to think about it too much. He wasn't in this line of work for recognition or praise, and he certainly wasn't interested in Karen's apologies, if they ever came. He had done what any firefighter would do in his position, and that was enough for him. As he finished cleaning up the station and sat down for a quick meal, one of his fellow firefighters, Jake, approached him with a thoughtful look on his face. Jake had been on the scene the night before and had seen everything unfold. "Hey man," Jake began, sitting across from Lucas at the small table in the break room. "You okay?" Lucas looked up, his face calm but tired. "Yeah, I'm good. Just tired, that's all." Jake nodded slowly, clearly debating whether to say more. After a moment of silence, he sighed and leaned forward, his voice low. "I don't know how you kept your cool last night. I mean, after what she said to you earlier in the day, and then you go and save her life. He shook his head, searching for the right words. "That's something else, man." Lucas smiled faintly, but it didn't reach his eyes. He had heard similar sentiments before, from people who couldn't understand how he could rise above the prejudice and racism he faced on a regular basis. But for Lucas, it wasn't about proving anything to anyone. It was about doing his job and living with integrity. "It wasn't about her," Lucas said quietly. "It's never about the person. It's about the job. If I let every ignorant person get under my skin, I wouldn't last a day out there." Jake nodded, clearly impressed but still troubled by the situation. "Yeah, I get that. I don't know if I could have done what you did." Lucas chuckled softly, shaking his head. "You'd be surprised what you can do when you don't have a choice. People like her, they don't see us. They only see what they want to see. But that doesn't change who we are." Jake stared at Lucas for a moment, then smiled. "You're a better man than most, Lucas." Lucas shrugged, not letting the compliment sink too deep. He didn't feel better than anyone. He just felt tired. Later that afternoon, after the shift had ended, Lucas headed home. His mind kept drifting back to the fire, to Karen, and to the way she had looked at him when she realized he was the one who had pulled her from the flames. He wasn't expecting any grand gestures of gratitude, but he couldn't help but wonder if Karen would ever come to terms with what had happened, with how her life had been saved by the very person she had dismissed as a threat. As Lucas pulled into his driveway, he noticed a car parked across the street. At first, he thought nothing of it, assuming it was one of the neighbors. But as he stepped out of his truck, he noticed the woman standing beside the car, her posture stiff, her face pale. It was Karen. For a moment, neither of them moved. Lucas stood by his truck, his keys still in his hand, while Karen stood frozen beside her car, as if unsure whether to approach. She was dressed in plain clothes, her hair tied back in a loose bun, and she looked nothing like the confident, sharp-tongued woman he had met the day before. Finally, Karen took a deep breath and crossed the street, her eyes flicking nervously between Lucas and the ground. When she reached him, she hesitated, wringing her hands together, clearly struggling to find the words. I wasn't sure if I should come," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I couldn't just leave things the way they are." Lucas watched her silently, waiting. He wasn't sure what she was going to say, but he could sense the weight of the moment pressing down on her. Karen took another deep breath and finally met his eyes. "I was wrong," she said, her voice trembling. "About you. About everything. I said things yesterday that were cruel, and I can't take them back, but—" She faltered, tears welling up in her eyes. "You saved my life. You didn't have to, but you did, and I don't know how to even begin to thank you for that." Lucas stayed quiet for a moment, watching her carefully. He could see the guilt written across her face, the realization that she had been forced to confront the ugliness of her own prejudice. It was a look he had seen before in others, but it never got easier to witness. "I wasn't saving you for thanks," Lucas said gently, his voice calm and steady. "I was doing my job, that's all." Karen wiped at her eyes, nodding quickly. I know, but still, I needed to say it. I needed you to know that I see things differently now. I'm not proud of how I acted before, but I want to do better. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I just wanted to say thank you." Lucas nodded slowly, appreciating her honesty, though he wasn't sure if it would change much. "We all have things to work on," he said, his tone measured. "What matters is what you do going forward." Karen looked at him, tears still brimming in her eyes, but this time there was a sense of relief in her expression. "Thank you," she whispered again, before turning and walking back to her car. Lucas watched as she drove away, his heart heavy but his mind clear. He didn't need her gratitude, but maybe, just maybe, this experience had planted a seed of change. Whether that seed would grow was up to her. All Lucas knew was that he had done his part. Days passed since the fire, and the remnants of Karen's house were slowly being cleared away. The neighborhood was quiet, but the memory of what had happened lingered like the scent of smoke in the air. People talked, whispered, and gossiped about the incident, about how a firefighter had saved the life of a woman who had disrespected him. But, like all things, the story began to fade as new events captured the attention of the community. For Lucas, life had returned to normal, or as normal as it could be in his line of work. He threw himself back into his routine at the firehouse, responding to calls, training new recruits, and attending more community outreach events. He never talked about what had happened with Karen, nor did he expect to. He had long accepted that not every story had a clean, satisfying ending. However, something had shifted in the community, even if it was subtle. During one of his fire safety talks at a local school, Lucas noticed the parents watching him with a new kind of awareness. There was a respect in their eyes that hadn't been there before, an acknowledgement of the deeper value he brought to their community. Some of these parents had probably heard about the incident with Karen, and while they may not have all known the details, they recognized that Lucas had risen above a situation that could have broken others. One afternoon, as Lucas prepared for another community event, he received a surprising phone call. It was from a local community organizer, inviting him to speak at a neighborhood gathering, a small meeting designed to bring people together to talk about fire safety, but also about broader issues of community support and understanding. The organizer didn't say it outright, but Lucas could tell from the tone of her voice that this meeting had been influenced by the events surrounding Karen's rescue. Lucas agreed to attend, though he didn't expect much. He had seen these gatherings before, well-meaning, but often superficial attempts to address deeper societal issues. Still, he was willing to give it a chance. After all, if his presence could help someone rethink their prejudices, even a little, it would be worth it. When Lucas arrived at the meeting, he was surprised to see a larger crowd than expected. The event was held in the neighborhood's community center, and families filled the small hall, chatting quietly as they waited for the speakers to begin. At the front of the room, a long table was set up with microphones, and several community leaders were already seated, preparing for the discussion. As Lucas made his way to the front, he felt a few eyes on him, but the stares were different now, less judgmental and more curious, perhaps even admiring. He sat down quietly, waiting for the meeting to begin, when he heard a familiar voice behind him. "Lucas?" He turned and saw Karen standing at the back of the room, her face pale but composed. She was holding a small notepad, her hands trembling slightly as she approached. Lucas hadn't expected to see her here, but then again, maybe this was part of the change she had spoken about. Karen made her way to the front of the room, nervously clearing her throat as she stood before the microphone. The room fell silent, all eyes on her as she prepared to speak. I don't normally do this, Karen began, her voice shaky but steadying with each word. But I need to say something. A few days ago, I went through something that changed my life forever. My home burned down, and I almost didn't make it out. She paused, her gaze drifting toward Lucas, who sat quietly listening. But that night, I was saved, Karen continued, her voice growing stronger. I was saved by someone I had insulted, disrespected, and judged without even knowing him. I made assumptions about him because of the color of his skin, and I'm ashamed of that. A murmur ran through the crowd, but Karen didn't stop. I don't expect sympathy or forgiveness, but I've realized something important. We need to change. I need to change. We need to stop judging people based on our fears and biases and start seeing them for who they really are. Her voice wavered, but she pushed on. Lucas saved my life. He didn't have to, but he did. And that taught me more about courage, humanity, and decency than I've ever known. I'm not saying I've figured it all out, but I want to start doing better. I hope we all do. The room was silent as Karen stepped back from the microphone, her hands trembling as she clutched her notepad. Her eyes darted nervously to Lucas, waiting for some kind of response. But Lucas only nodded in acknowledgement. He could see the weight of what she had just done. And while it wasn't perfect, it was a start. After Karen's speech, the discussion moved on to other topics: fire safety, community support, and ways to bring people together. But Lucas knew that something deeper had happened here tonight. It wasn't just about fire safety or neighborhood gatherings anymore. It was about understanding, about confronting the prejudices that people carried with them every day, whether they realized it or not. As the meeting wrapped up, several people came up to Lucas to thank him for his work, shaking his hand and expressing their gratitude for his bravery. It was more than he was used to, but he accepted their thanks with quiet grace, knowing that his role in the community was changing. Just as Lucas was about to leave, Karen approached him one last time. This time there were no tears, no trembling hands. She stood a little taller, her shoulders squared as she faced him. "I'm trying," she said softly. "I don't know if I'll ever get it all right, but I'm trying." Lucas smiled, his voice calm and kind. "That's all anyone can do." Karen nodded, a faint smile crossing her lips. "Thank you again, for everything." Lucas gave her one last nod before turning to leave the hall. As he stepped outside into the cool evening air, he felt a sense of peace wash over him. He hadn't set out to change anyone's mind, but in the end, maybe that's exactly what he had done. Not by force or by anger, but by simply being who he was, a firefighter, a protector, and most of all, a human being.